in this session, I just wanted to position for you guys this whole notion of project management within this international development aid framework. So you've probably studied in past classes, maybe some of you, just how foreign aid is administered around the world, and whether it's from our government or it's from multilateral organizations like the UN or World Bank or IMF. There's a term that we use, and it's called international assistance. Sometimes we call it international aid or even foreign aid. And there's a lot of terms that we use to describe financial resources when they're provided for the purpose of funding development initiatives. But you have to be really aware that the terms that people use are not synonymous. There's some similar terms that people often use in their place. It's like ODA, or official development assistance, we call it. So, you say, oh, we're contributing this for ODA. There's another term called international assistance envelope. And generally, you're going to hear that, people use these terms a lot, and they kind of, throw them around like they're all equal. But to be honest, they can't be interchanged as terms. So in Canada, for instance, the ODA doesn't cover the assistance that comes from provincial and municipal sources. And people forget Global Affairs Canada, or what we refer to as GAC, which is our International Foreign Assistance Department in Canada, is not the only government body of our government that gives financial assistance for overseas aid projects. So there's actually quite a few windows of funding. And you've probably come across a lot of discussion and chatter in the news about debt relief. We use that, we studied that term a lot for developing countries. And especially now during the pandemic, you're hearing a lot about industrial countries extending debt relief. But it's not straightforward. Essentially, it's meaning about measures that reduce or refinance debt to make it easier for the borrower to repay it. And this means that, Canada might forgive the debt owed from, let's say, India, or it may reduce the interest rate somewhat, or it might consolidate their debt somehow. And there can always be a tie-in as well of debt relief to foreign assistance. Sometimes they merge those things together and create what's called a debt relief instrument. So it might be tied to something else that the Government of Canada has as a priority. And when it comes to planning national contributions to international aid, the UN set a target of 0.7% of gross domestic product, or GDP, that really should be set aside by industrial countries for international aid. But look at the chart on this slide, and you can see that, with the exception of European countries, and there's a lot of really small European countries there who have met their commitment, most of the other ones have fallen really short. And it's very sad that in the case of Canada, we're really off the mark. And our NGO community has been petitioning for as long as I can remember. I know I've written personally tons of letters to the government to raise their contribution to 0.7%, which in theory would make more funds available for project development overseas. But of course, we need to understand what type of instruments of funding actually exist and are being used. So there are a lot of kinds of instruments. I'll just cover them really fast because they do impact, a lot of our project work overseas. But a lot of instruments of international assistance. And when you're in a position of doing project management, designing projects, seeking funding, implementing, and so on, you need to be really familiar with those instruments. And the reason is you can get ahead of the trends and the agreements that are being forged between countries, and then can potentially tap into the instruments in different ways for the benefit of your projects or your agency. And I've listed some of the main instruments on this slide. There's actually more, but these are some of the key ones. And they range from financial support that's directed at government strategies and policies, to aid that's tied to trade, to social initiatives, to humanitarian aid as well. And the choice of an aid instrument for a contributing or donor government is super important. So for example, if the delivery of basic health services is considered a priority, and the donor generally, prefers to support a developing country's health ministry directly, it may decide to invest in reforming the government's health department. And that's opposed to, say, choice of contributing to projects specifically that might be implemented by NGOs or a private sector, where they're delivering health services directly to communities. So there's sort of two different two different ways that the money might be directed, and it varies from time to time. Or perhaps the donor decides to set up its own parallel delivery of the health services. So in some cases, donor, in this case, say Canada, for example, Canada government, they might think that the services are urgent and that the recipient government that's going to get the money isn't able to deliver them in time. And that's a one example, but there are a lot of different ways that financial aid can be transferred country to country. And it's really important to read the fine print. When you hear about the big aid announcements, sometimes I'm sure you guys have picked up, the minister will come out and say, GAC announces $300 million for women's health and rights, for example. You might see that. Go and check where the money is going. All right. Everyone gets really excited. I know in the NGO world, we all got really excited. It's $300 million. We've got to write proposals, get ready. But is it going to governments? Is it going to NGOs? Is it going to multilaterals like the UN? Or is it going to preferred, pre-registered, pre-certified implementing partners? It's good to know this stuff so you can position yourself to access the money if there's a window of opportunity for your agency. But I've learned and been really disappointed many times that more often than not, the money is not going into the hands of traditional implementing partners like NGOs. It's going government to government aid. And there are all sorts of reasons for freeing up the aid in the first place. Okay, so why governments would want to do that. And for the astute development officer, it's good to know. They say, whoever they are, you follow the money, that expression. But in this case, that's true. But you should also be aware of the rationale or the reasons for it, why they're giving the money. So, for instance, Canada would look at a country's needs and statistics and trends. Perhaps they'd even look at the density of other donors in that country as it decides whether it's a priority for foreign aid or not. They'll have a database of previously implemented projects so they can, gauge the success that they've had or the failures. And this is going to often tell them if there's been a general success around delivering aid through their projects, or whether the host government supported their initiatives, facilitated the flow of funds, or in many cases, were they throwing up obstacles to the aid assistance that Canada was giving to that country? So donor governments will always look at the general capacity of a host country to handle the funds. And they want to ensure that there's going to be what's called aid effectiveness. Okay, I'm sure you've probably heard the term, but if you haven't, and Global Affairs talks about it a lot, and aid effectiveness is the way the delivery takes place of that financial assistance. And sometimes there's going to be times when the aid is just urgent. Government of Canada might see it as absolutely urgent. It's been a crisis in Haiti and it needs to be delivered now. So in some cases, the Canadian government will send money immediately through the deployment of the DART team. That's the Disaster Assistance Response Team. And that's through the country's military. And so the military will go out to provide clean water, logistical support, clearing roads, which they did in Nepal, which was really very exciting to see up in the remote areas of Nepal. Canadian forces with tractors pushing the boulders off the roads. It was very cool. Then, of course, you have the usual foreign policies and trade strategies that come into play as well when determining who gets what aid, this precious package of aid. And this is not a surprise to anyone. I'm sure we've seen the US, the game with China, and the numerous other countries, and often industrial governments, they're looking for ways and means of enhancing their private sector investments, upping their trade, getting a better trade deal. And foreign aid, although it has to be apolitical always, unfortunately can often be a leverage point for tying the purchase of equipment, food, and other necessities. That's just the reality of our aid structure. And in some cases, it might be to help our farmers out to sell products. Sounds really good. Otherwise, their products would go to waste without a consumer. So it's directed that way. And finally, there could just be the plain old negotiation between Canada and the recipient government, who they want to work out a deal for in the future, get some agreements in place, create a supply chain, access mineral rights, or some other benefit that they may perceive. So tons and tons of reasons for why aid instruments would be created. But bottom line, whatever the modality for delivering the foreign assistance, it normally results in two things: the production of goods and the production of services. And For an international development government body like GAC, it tries to have a humanitarian and sustainable process attached to it. And this is just to ensure that funds are traceable, they're aid effective, and the donor and the host government they sign this pact so they're mutually accountable for the funds. And when you get into project design, this stuff's going to be really important. These kinds of parameters or conditions are going to be very much at the forefront of project design work and implementation. Now, as you're reflecting on these different modalities and instruments, ones you've heard about, you've no doubt you've seen some of these at play in the media. So it might not surprise you to hear me say, don't quote me, although we're recording this, foreign aid can be very ineffective and very cost inefficient. Probably doesn't surprise you because we're constantly hearing about huge overheads on our projects, costs of delivering aid to the field, even the overheads that go along with something as compassionate as child sponsorship. Lots of child sponsorship agencies out there, or those simple transactions like buying bikes for school kids. Anytime you're moving money from A to B, especially when it's involving working in remote communities, fragile countries, we really can't expect anything less. So donors are constantly reminding implementing agencies and the public that we need to be aid effective. Okay. So we keep our overheads as low as possible. Everyone's always competing. To get that money, you've got to demonstrate low overheads, and that our direct activities to projects and our administration which are basically called indirect or none activities. It has to be in a kind of 80-20 ratio. That's what the Charity Act in Canada has basically stipulated. So not much less than that, 80% direct, 20% overhead. That we're accountable for every penny that goes overseas through our projects, that we have a clear mandate and agreements with our local partners to ensure we can comply with the revenue agency's regulations. And if you look on CRA, when it talks about international aid, it's what's called the Charity Act, or they just refer to it as the Act. Okay, and that's what most of the nonprofit and profit organizations are referring to when they're moving their money overseas from donor governments. And it's not an easy process. I would say, in their defense, it's not a cheap process. So it may seem really high, it probably is really high, but the cost of delivering foreign aid can be pretty expensive, and there's just no way around that. And this will have a direct impact on our projects that we're implementing. So as a project manager, you're going to be having many nights where you're crying because your budgets just aren't adding up, because you just can't get enough money to actually run the project. It's pretty awful. And if we look at government to government aid, we can see all kinds of issues related to corruption, misdirection of funds, lack of reporting, misuse of funds. I'm sure you've heard all of this, and the list goes on and on and on. So the choice of instruments basically means the pros and cons in every case. Each has its own challenge that you're going to use. But the bottom line is that the success will depend on the host government's adherence to good policies and practices. So to how much it engages in your project or the delivery of that aid, what priorities it sets to follow through on, and especially how open it is to working with the donor government or with the implementing agencies that are actually running the projects. And so you'll see firsthand, as soon as you get out to the field, it's virtually impossible, I would say, to implement projects these days without the endorsement and involvement of the local authorities, because they have the mandate to deliver basic services to communities where you're going to be operating. So as a project manager, you can't work around them. And I would say you certainly shouldn't. Some agencies do, okay? So, just to be aware of that, because it's a hassle, it's easier for them. It is difficult sometimes working with local governments. But ultimately, you need their involvement for the sustainability of your projects and to, well, frankly, get things done on time and in a cost-effective way. So local government in those countries, you can say, affects the triple constraint of your project management. Oh, wait a minute. I just gave away a keyword that you're going to hear about a lot in this course, triple constraint. Anyway, it sounds ominous. I'm going to talk about it in a few minutes. Budget aid, before we finish up, this part of the discussion, I want to take the two big common categories of aid instruments, okay? One of them is budget aid, the other one is project aid. So aid that goes to implementing partners. And these are the two modalities that you probably will hear the most about. So when I hear an announcement, as I said, on funding for foreign aid, I'm always first off trying to figure out which of these two instruments are the funds going to, because they rarely will say when they make those announcements. Let's briefly look at the budget aid first. So you've got this fancy chart that I put together. I've simplified as much as I can what we could describe as the economy and market of a developing country by defining it as a triangle. You'll often see a market defined that way. And within this triangle, you have the apex, or the topmost point. And this is often described as where you'll find the government, the major corporation players in the private sector. You'll get the banks, big wealth investment firms, institutions, things like that. And you'll also see the large multilateral actors like the Bretton Woods Institutes, or I mean the World Bank and the IMF, and other big actors as well. So in a functioning market, all right, a healthy market, one would expect to see that these big institutions located around the capital, usually around the capital, that's where their headquarters are, or around larger cities. And for private sector companies, they would have, you would expect their tentacles, supply chains out and about in the markets that are close to those urban centers, because they're looking for a reasonable density of population for their market, people to actually create a demand and buy their products, and where they can reduce risk in expanding their supply chains and their product distribution. But if the market is working well, one would expect also to see a functioning sector of small, medium enterprises, all right, like we have here in Canada. And they're filling a really important role in the market, okay? That's the middle part there of the chart. And their role is to provide business development services like credit, insurance, capacity building, materials, supplies, contractors, all that stuff. And when possible, they're the groups that we would most often work with and connect with in terms of our project initiatives in rural communities. Okay, so we lean on them. We rely heavily on them for our supply chains as well. And they also constitute one of the largest employers in most countries, okay, if they have a good functioning market. Most of the people will be employed there. So the big role that they play is to connect the urban hubs to more remote areas of the country, and thereby ensuring that products and services are expanded, that warehousing of goods is available, consumers in all corners of the country have access to these big products. And very importantly, they open up market opportunities for farmers in the rural sector and to small businesses as well. So let's take India, for example, where you have a huge country, a huge population, but a massive areas that are uncovered by supply chains of goods and services. So in effect, you have huge swaths of geographic areas in India that are in absolute poverty, without electricity, without all the main means of production, while other parts of the country are thriving, where they're putting people on the moon. So it's quite staggering the stark difference that we find in India. And in this picture, most of the big corporations and small firms are going to be around New Delhi, the capital, which is marked on my map here. And if you thought that was New Delhi, you were mistaken, because that's not New Delhi. Okay, that's New Delhi. There. Okay. Sorry, that was for Joshua. I couldn't resist borrowing from Stephen Colbert. But as you see, the problem is that the states capitals of India they're not supplying or providing sufficient coverage in their reach and in their supply chain. So despite this being a really simplistic depiction of what's happening, it shows how it's really impossible to meet the demands of people across India. And that's why there's so many unreached villages in that country. And ultimately, there's a paucity of small and medium enterprises to fill the gaps in the markets that will tie the big companies with with the potential consumers in the various markets. And there was an author in India, C.K. Prahalad. He wrote some really good books. And he argued that if we could find a way to aggregate the combined wealth of the poor, it would rival the top 4 or 5 industrial country GDPs, something like $3-4 trillion. So he argued, why can't we work with some of the less poor in the market, those with a little bit of wealth and capital, and aggregate them into incubators or hubs that could provide opportunities to those who were most in need? So rather than targeting the ultra poor, who have very little wealth actually to invest, that would be another solution. So it's a really an interesting discussion to have, but it's a lot longer discussion than we have time for here. What you will find out, it's really hard to sell that idea to donors, because when project funds are being freed up to meet the demands, they're being freed up to meet the demands of the most vulnerable and the most marginalized in our projects. So sometimes it's a little hard to be creative in that sense. So here's the problem we face for the past several decades or more in development. And whoever falls below that red line that's on my slide is said to be below the poverty line. Okay, you've heard that term, it's pretty simple. And really, the easiest way for a country to reduce poverty, if you can guess, is simply to do this: one, two, three. Oh, I just lowered the poverty line. And as awful as that sounds, putting instead of $1.50, let's make it $1. India did it twice. Both times I was in India actually when it happened and it hit the newspaper. And the amount of money they were talking about that people would actually have to make a day to not be poor could barely buy a cup of tea, a cup of chai. And so it really was quite horrible that they just sort of eliminated half the poor in India just by dropping the poverty line. And when an agency comes in and delivers a project, a single project or a group of projects, which we're going to define later, but basically that's a program, a group of projects is a program. We're usually targeting the group of people that are classified as below the poverty line, okay? So donors almost always want us to demonstrate that our projects are delivering aid to those most in need. And the ultra poor, or at least the very poor, fit with that category. But I will argue, and based on what C.K. Prahalad was arguing as well, in my experience over the years, that projects tend to work with this group. And if they're lucky, they might raise those marginalized people from ultra poor to very poor, or if they're lucky and successful, they might even make them moderately poor. But the problem that I have is that they are still poor. Okay, they still fall below the poverty line. So then that is an argument around success of projects and how successful our foreign aid is being through these projects that are delivering the aid. And I'd argue further that the fundamental problem with this is that, well, our projects fail to deliver a sufficient amount of financial aid to those who are able to invest it and improve their means of production or their acquisition of employment, finding jobs. And that can be informal or formal jobs, doesn't matter. So the result is that those projects that are implemented are ultimately unsustainable. Okay, in my view, they're unsustainable. And they make a marginal contribution to international development that's moderately trackable. Okay, but they're not integrated sufficiently with the market higher up the pyramid. We talked about that higher up. They don't connect with the private sector. They don't align with government policy and practices very well. They don't build capacity of the critical small and medium enterprises to fill those really important roles in the market and in the economy. So it's an issue. It's an issue definitely we're struggling with in this sector. And the project results help improve some aspects of people's lives, you can argue, which is great, but they don't have a lasting impact that dramatically changes fundamentally the way that people live in communities in the longer term. And to me, this is the critical point to eliminating poverty. And it's why we often see church and parachurch bodies working in communities, but they're not with other key development stakeholders. You'll rarely see them working alongside. Not all, I don't want to criticize all of them, but a good chunk of them, I would say, tend not to work with some of the other stakeholders. They stay very siloed in the work that they do. So what we end up with are projects that are more charity in focus than they are adding value to a country or even a community's economic development. And I challenge you as a project manager to look very realistically at the two models when you have a project and really decide, because you'll hear people say, oh, we have an international development project out in Africa doing this, this, and this. And I'll look at it and I'll say, It's not sustainable. It's going to fall when you leave. And you're really basically just putting money in people's pocket for today. That's charity, in my view. So you just got to be really astute to sort of see those two things back to back. So just back to the model and the aid instrument of budget aid to government, you can now see the double trouble of transferring aid money to the topmost part of the triangle, okay, what we were talking about earlier. If there's corruption or if there's leakage of funds or misappropriation, or they're using the funds for other priorities, then we're not going to see any tangible benefit trickling down to the poorest of the poor, and possibly not even to those SMEs in the middle of the market that we talked about. Well, so much for the trickle down theory of development, right? Those of you guys who've taken international development have heard the trickle down theory. I've just completely smashed it. So I'm sorry about that. Single handedly burst the bubble on two development myths all at once. So it's not bad for our first class. I'll do more of those. You can now at least understand why donor governments start to tie their aid, as they say. You know, they attach it to something. They'll direct it to certain sectors. They'll get agreements from host governments to do that. And they'll allocate percentages of their funds to certain groups that they trust in the country. You know, maybe it's a women's group or it's an advocacy group. And they might even support NGOs to ensure that at least some of the aid trickles down or gets to, you know, the people who are most poor, that's allocated by the host government to those development actors. So it's not so much a trickle down then, it's more of a like force it down. You know, their donors are basically forcing the government to give that money directly to the place where it's going to impact the most marginalized people. So in this slide, we're looking at the same model, but this is where the project aid comes into play. Okay, so we're skipping the big players at the top. We're skipping the trickle down effect that I just mentioned. We're intentionally investing financial aid into the weaker parts of the market. And up until the last 10 years or so, the only actors in this part of the triangle were the INGOs, the international NGOs, the nonprofit agencies, or local NGOs, churches, community-based organizations. But it's really exciting now, as you're going into it, is we're seeing the introduction of what we're calling non-traditional actors in development. And fundamentally, this is the entry of the private sector, that sector that typically was grouped around the top of the triangle. And because of years of work into the Millennium Development Goals and now the Sustainable Development Goals, the private sector has grown into an important and an even vital stakeholder in the development process. In fact, I'm going to go so far as to say that without their involvement, the private sector, it's going to be near impossible to solve all of the issues that this world is facing at the current time. There just is not enough public money, and we just don't have the expertise in the traditional actors that we've had over the last few decades. So the key challenge will be to see how all those traditional partners can figure out how to work effectively with them. Because if they can't figure it out, frankly, I think they're going to go obsolete. So we've got to figure out how we partner with them. But anyway, that's for a different discussion, a different time. But I wanted you to be aware of it because, you know, these are critical players in the process of project management going forward, and you're definitely going to encounter them. So the problem with project aid is that while it sounds good, it seems to get the crux of the challenges more immediately as well. And it's a way to meet the needs of the most marginalized people, but it's harder to manage the projects typically because you got a lot of small projects, you know, rather than give a big bulk of money to the government and say, okay, do something with it. Now you're giving it to say 25 projects and you've got to manage 25 projects. So, you know, it's more complex. And as I mentioned, there's going to be huge overheads because it's not cheap. Give it to the government, no overheads, right? It's just a straight transfer, a check is written over. But with projects, you're going to have all the overheads. So, you know, you're losing 20 or 30%, maybe more, of your money right off the top. And donor governments are often going to redirect their funds to specific priorities that they have. Like I said, they're going to, you know, lay down a prescriptive program approach for NGOs to follow, you know, rather than letting it be driven by grassroots organizations or based on community needs. And even then, it's going to require having really strict accountability procedures, good project managers, great project managers in place to ensure that all that money is going to be properly spent. It's not going to be diverted by host government. Feel they probably should have the funds themselves so they can prioritize. So it takes a lot Well, that's a lot to take in a short time. I'm going to stop here on 8 instruments now. We don't need to go into huge amounts of detail for now, but I wanted you to be aware of it and understand the basic mechanics behind how aid is transferred to the developing countries and how it may play into the design and implementation of your project. And when you get funds for a project, okay, when you receive those funds, you're going to be responsible for them. That's the role of the project manager. And depending on the type of project manager is always going to be responsible and accountable. And those two terms are very different, but they are accountable for the way money is spent. And depending on the type of instrument being used to fund your project, this can be a crazy amount of responsibility on the shoulders of a project manager. My one of my last projects was about 50 million a year, and that's public money. That's taxpayer money, and I've got to make sure it's all spent. So it wasn't a small undertaking, and I had a lot of sleepless nights over that. But it's not all bad. There's lots of benefits that come from being a project manager or being responsible, and I still highly recommend that you try it one day. I'm not trying to scare you off or anything like that. So I'm going to stop here just for a minute, give you guys a chance if you have any feedback or comments on what I've gone over so far, anything that wasn't quite clear before we go to the last section of tonight. Okay, so I'll give you a choice, guys. If you want, we can take a break here, or if you'd like, I'll just keep going, whatever you prefer. Maybe if you want to keep going, just put your hand up. Okay, we got one. Anyone like to take a break instead? Okay, Sarah doesn't, you don't mind? Joshua, you want a break? Can we take like a 5 minute break? Is that okay? And then we can end a little bit early? Okay, great. Super. So 5 minutes and then I'll see you guys back here.